It looks like we are live, so welcome to everyone watching us today. My name is Adriano Bossoni. I am Director of Analysis at RANE, and I am joined today by my colleague Matteo Ilardo to discuss a very interesting column that he wrote yesterday. So, Matteo, in your column, you write that 2024 is going to be a very important year in Europe because there is going to be elections in many countries across the continent. There is also going to be a very big election in June to appoint the members of the European Parliament. And in most, if not all of those elections, far right, nationalist, anti immigration, Eurosceptical political parties will perform quite well. So let's start with the basics for the people watching us today. What are the main elections that we're looking at in 2024?
Yeah, Adriano, you said it already. We'll have a number of elections, an exceptionally high number of elections in the continent throughout the year, starting from not in terms of the first one, but perhaps the most important, the largest, is the election of the European Parliament, which will happen next June. Of course, we know the European Parliament plays a somewhat marginal role in the decision-making process within the EU, but still has an important role when it comes to approving key legislations in every area, policy areas within the EU. There, we'll see right-wing parties performing particularly strongly. We'll see a parliament that is not necessarily going to be dominated by the far right, but we'll see far right, or at least radical right-wing parties gaining more seats. The ultimate composition of the parliament will look something similar to what it is now, but definitely it would be more conservative, less environmentally ambitious, more skeptical of any policy that may weaken traditional industries in Europe, and more skeptical of migration policies.
And what about the national elections? There are also individual countries holding elections.
Exactly. So besides the EU elections, we'll have elections in countries such as Austria, Belgium, Portugal, Romania. In all these elections, right-wing parties, far-right parties, are expected to perform pretty well. They are either first in the polls or top three in all these countries. They are expected, the far-right party in Austria is expected to actually enter government, perhaps topping the polls, therefore having a leading role within the government. Whereas in the other three countries, we have something called in Europe called cordon sanitaire. It's a French word to basically define a taboo from mainstream political parties in collaborating with extreme forces, both on the left and on the right. This so far has held, but it may not continue to hold next year.
So let's talk about these parties a bit more. We are, just for simplification purposes, we are calling all of them like far right or nationalists, but are all these parties the same? Or I guess there are national differences. So I guess the question is, what are the generalities of these parties? Like broadly speaking, what do they have in common?
So that's a key question here to understand the resurgence of the far right within the continent. And that's because the European countries share very different political traditions, very different historical experiences. And these creates fundamental differences between parties across Europe, both on the left and on the right. When it comes to far right parties, which again, we're using as an umbrella term to capture them all, we see commonalities in skepticism towards the European Union as a sovereign national entity that somewhat reduces national sovereignty of each of the member states where these parties are. We also see a more hawkish tone and approach to migration, which is one of the main elements that is fueling the rise of far right due to the high level of migration in Europe. And we see a tone towards climate policies that is one that is not denying climate change like we would have seen years ago, perhaps from fringe parties in Europe, but is one that is advocating for more diluted climate policies that do not excessively increase the cost for businesses and households when it comes to trying and curbing emissions. So what this all translates at the European level is hard to say. It's hard to say because each party has different agendas despite these commonalities within single countries, and also because at the EU level, at the same time, by definition, these parties pursue national ideologies and push for agenda that put their countries first. So trying and achieve coordination at the EU level and have an effective um, push on EU policies will be harder for these parties to coordinate. But that doesn't mean that we won't see an effect on policy next year, which I'm happy to elaborate on.
Before we go into that, let's talk about the constraints for a minute or two. It seems to me that many of these parties often find out that winning the election is actually the easy part, and then you have to govern, and that's when the institutional, political, financial constraints emerge, right? Only a few months ago, or well, a little over a year ago, the entire European continent was terrified about the prospect of two far-right parties and a right-wing party in Italy forming a coalition. And yet, even though the government has done lots of very controversial things, and a lot of people in Italy are not particularly happy with the current government, there was no push to exit the Eurozone, no push to exit NATO or the European Union. Italy actually got closer to Ukraine and was more critical of Russia. They just exited the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So there are constraints, right? So even if these parties win some of many, all of the elections that you just mentioned, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will do everything they are campaigning for, right? So could you please talk about those constraints a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And constraints in this case are as important as the very ideology of the party to understand what a far right government or a government that has a far right party in it, what will it do on a policy level? What will it do once it takes office? As we saw in Italy, the constraints were mostly economic. Italy is a country with a 140% public debt GDP ratio, which means that it doesn't really have much space to pursue its ideological preferences when it comes to economic policies, fiscal policies. So, despite the very large, let's say, electoral promises of all three coalition parties during the campaign, then we actually saw fiscal and economic policy in Italy that looked very similar to the one of the previous government, which was the most classical technocratic pro-EU, very cautious government in Rome. We also saw a similar thing in foreign policy. We saw the Meloni government playing a very cautious, pragmatic foreign policy, both in Europe and outside of Europe. Within the European Union, it sought to collaborate with Brussels, to have a proactive, collaborative approach on everything EU related with other EU countries. And that's despite the Euroscepticism that characterized the rise of her Brothers of Italy party. And then we saw a foreign policy that was very active abroad, seeking collaborations with and signing strategic partnership and energy supply deals in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific, in North Africa, but always within the framework of a very Atlanticist Italian foreign policy. So these sort of constraints are those that will also affect other European countries. We just saw a far-right party stopping an election in the Netherlands, the PVV led by Geert Wilders in the Dutch elections in November. And that made a lot of noise on the news. Of course, everybody's worried about the new far-right government in the Netherlands, but we are actually highlighting how even the Netherlands, despite having a much better economic situation than Italy, will be constrained by a series of economic, legal, institutional, political aspects. For instance, Wilders alone will not be able to form a government it will have to collaborate with a center-right moderate party to create a government coalition. And that's perhaps the main force that will constrain far-right parties when it comes to making policies. At the same time, and here I conclude, center-right parties are also trying to outcompete far-right parties within the electorate by also espousing some of their ideas, by absorbing some of their proposals within their own platform, which means that overall, the debate on a number of policy areas such as migration and climate is actually being pushed much to the right, which means that even if far-right parties do not take over Europe, they still have a big influence on EU politics and EU policies just by becoming more popular.
So we are running out of time, but one final question from me, Matteo. I've been looking at the opinion polls for the European Parliament elections, and I know that they are still more than 6 months away, so a lot could change between now and then. But there is this very interesting situation in which, as you said, the center right and the center left will probably remain the most important groups in the parliament, but the far right is rising in polls, as we've been discussing, whereas the Greens and the liberals, which are also pro environment, are decreasing in opinion polls. So can we speak of a green fatigue of sorts in Europe? Are people, some sectors of the electorate, are they getting worried that maybe the transition happened too fast, or that is impacting too much on the operation cost of companies and households? So is there such thing as a green fatigue, or is this just my perception?
No, it is a thing, and it actually has been going on already for quite a while, for the past few months, in preparation for EU elections. And that's exactly because of the argument that I was making earlier, that centrist party, particularly conservative, right-wing, moderate parties, are trying to compete with far right, understanding that the wind is changing when it comes to promoting emission reduction policies that affect industries such as the farming industries that move a lot of voters in rural areas of Europe, or heavy industries such as the steel making industries, or the automotive industries. For instance, when it comes to banning the sales of new fossil fuel powered cars by 2035, we saw a backlash there at the state level as well last year. So all these policy moves from Brussels are experiencing a backlash among the electorate in Europe. And this is already in preparation for election. This is already translating, as you said, in a green fatigue, because parties feel less comfortable putting their weight behind these proposals, and are seeking to either slowing them down, delaying them, scrapping them altogether, but most often at least watering down, which effectively reduces or slows down the energy transition in Europe.
Okay, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today, but thank you so much, Matteo, for joining me today live. If people are interested in reading Matteo's work and everybody else's work here at RANE, they can join us at ranenetwork.com. There you will find daily updates on geopolitical affairs. So thank you so much for joining us live today. Everyone watching, have a great weekend. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.